Hey guys, I'm Bernie from All About CG, and today we're gonna have a look at how to create decals from a high poly mesh and use it later on in a scene. This is especially a pretty useful workflow if you want a highly detailed model with lots of small details, for example a robot with all the nuts and bolts and screws, and when adding it as objects you would add hundreds of thousands of polys, and when using decals you maybe get away with only about 1/4 per screw with the same amount of details. Of course there are a few downsides, but we're gonna discuss them later. So first we're gonna delete our default cube, and I'm gonna insert a cylinder in order to create my complex object. I'm gonna put it down to 24 vertices in order to have a multiple of 6, because we're gonna make a 6-edged screw, and I'm gonna make it a little bit flatter. I'll add a subsurf modifier here with 2 subdivisions, shade it smooth and enable auto smoothing in order to get a beautiful display geometry. And in face selection mode I'm gonna edge crease the top and the bottom face in order to catch sharp edges, and I'm gonna insert the top face to place my hexagon inside of this. So I'm select this whole loop and cursor to selected and add a circle, and I'm gonna set the circle vertices to 6, and my circle is then added as a hexagon, and I'm gonna scale it down a little bit to make it fit. So this looks pretty good. Gonna select this face loop, make it a bit wider by scaling it, and now I'm inserting loop cuts on the edges of the hexagon in order to match the amount of edges on the outer ring, and I'm gonna do it 6 times. And now I'm selecting both edge loops, and I'm gonna use Ctrl E, bridge edge loops. So this looks pretty good. With Shift E I'm gonna increase the edge crease weight, and I'm gonna extrude it down a little bit and close the face by pressing F. And so now I have to edge crease those edges too in order to see all 6 edges of the screw itself. That looks pretty good. So we're doing Shift E and 1. So yeah, looks good. And now I want to set the edge bevel weight on the outer edge, because I want to bevel it with a higher amount than the other edges. And now I'm gonna add a bevel modifier, and I'm starting with this outer edge. So I'm selecting the mode weight to bevel, and first gonna check if the scale is on 1, because otherwise we would get problems, but it looks good. And now I want to increase the segments, and I'm seeing some sort of artifacts. So I'm gonna put up the auto smoothing to 60, looks good. And maybe I should increase the distance, but nothing's happening. Can uncheck clamp override, and I see I'm overriding the distance, but I guess 0.1 meter would be sufficient. So I'm gonna keep it this way. And now I'm gonna duplicate this bevel modifier and set a mode to angle to bevel all sharp edges with a distance of 1 centimeter. And yeah, it looks pretty good. Just a small error due to pressing caps lock, but the edges are looking good. And what I'm seeing now is some sort of artifacts. Yeah, just have to make sure. But we're first gonna make the outer ring, which is the hole where the screw is put into. And I'm creating this from circle with a subsurf modifier, which I copied from the source object. And in edit mode I'm gonna extrude it up. Orthogonal front view to align it pretty with the top of the screw, as we're not storing height information in normal method but only normal vectors. And now I'm gonna extrude the rim of the hole, and it looks pretty good. We have some sort of curvature down there, and with the smoothing it works pretty good. Now I'm checking normals. This is happening quite often. We have the normals facing in the wrong direction due to the fact we started from a circle. And I'm just correcting this by flipping all normals. So the top normals are pointing upwards and the inner are pointing inward, which is the correct direction for baking. So gotta check the screencast keys, still working. And now I have to create a plane, but first we're gonna join them. And now, yeah, it looks pretty good. We have a single object, and in Madcap we will check our distortions of the normal. Yeah, we see the mistakes here, so we have some sort of star pattern. We can avoid this by simply insetting the face another time, and this fixed our problem. That looks pretty good. And I think we'll keep it this way and change back to studio lighting. But first, this artifact some kind of distracting, and I guess that's because we have some problems with the normal. So we're putting back the edge we deleted before, and I think it's the best way as we had it before. So we're gonna keep it this way. And I'm switching back to studio lighting and adding my plane, which I'm baking my maps to. And this plane has to be slightly bigger than the complex object itself, so you should watch out for having a margin and maybe scale it down a little bit, but no, must fit. We applied the scale. It's not necessary to move it upwards to really match the plane, but I always like to do so because I get some impression which will be above surface level on the target and which will be below, considering the illusion of depth. And I'm inserting another phase loop here in order to have normals pointing straight upwards. And I'm gonna check it here. It looks pretty good. So the normals of the outer ring are pointing upwards, which will be this way even if we use the subsurface modifier. And now it's time to prepare it for baking. So we don't have to add a material to our complex object, but I always like to in order to see it better. So we're making it a metallic screw. And on the plane, we also need a material and we need to add an image texture. So we add in an image texture node. And first we're gonna create a new texture and call this screw normal, which is the normal map for the screw. And could set it to a 4K resolution, or maybe 2K would be sufficient for this tutorial. We don't need the alpha channel, and we will also use 32-bit float. Another thing important, change it to non-color because we're baking a normal map. I have to switch to cycles in order to bake this whole thing. And the resolution or in the performance isn't that necessary, but here in baking I have to select the normal mode, which goes into tangent space. And what I have to make sure is, as we're using selected to active, that we have an active object, which is the plane, because we're baking to the plane here. And we wouldn't have need to split up the mesh before, because we could bake multiple selected objects to our active object. So I'm gonna separate it by pressing P and separating by selection to have the rim and the screw itself separated. And I'm gonna select the plane as my active object in the selection, selecting selected to active. We don't need a cage object, which would limit the distance of the rays, but I set the ray distance to 1 meter, which should be sufficient and delivers the best result. And now we're gonna make sure that our image texture node is selected in the material of the plane, and then we're gonna hit bake. And now the texture has baked and it looks pretty good. And in order to verify the results, I'm gonna insert another plane, move it in the Y direction to have it side by side, and create a new shader, adding an image texture and selecting our screw normal here. Don't have to put a non-color data in here because it knows it, because it's a known texture to this scene. Adding the normal map node, and now I can watch this. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Not any obvious mistakes, but something I would like to correct. I would like the plane of the opening to be a bit narrower than the top of the opening in order to have some sort of curve down there, of normal vectors, to get a little bit more depth illusion. Maybe not that small. So this should be sufficient and should sometimes save your work because Blender tends to crash sometimes. This looks pretty good. So I'm selecting both the rim and the screw, and the plane is the last object, and verify that the texture is still selected, and then I'm gonna hit bake again, and it's baking the texture again. And now we're finished. We're seeing some sort of difference. In order to update this, sometimes Blender doesn't update, so you just have to disconnect and reconnect a node, which will freshen the whole rendering process. I'm scrolling in here, it looks pretty good with the 2K resolution. And when I'm looking, yeah, it should be sufficient from the size. And now we're gonna bake the other things too that we need, which is first the ambient occlusion. Therefore we have baking mode, so we have to select the plane. I'm deleting the texture and creating a new one, screw AO, which will be the same resolution. And we're gonna keep our settings, set it to non-color data. And I'm gonna select the baking mode of ambient occlusion. So first we make sure we have selected the right objects. And then bake type ambient occlusion, selected to active is still enabled, and we're gonna bake this. And the AO map takes a bit of time for baking. I've speeded up the process here. And I'm seeing here a black face because Blender already showed me it has successfully baked the AO, which obviously wasn't the case, and he's baking it now. That's a problem I've encountered with Blender 2.82 recently, but I guess that will vanish in the future. And now I'm seeing my ambient occlusion map, which gives me my AO shadows that I want for more realism. And I'm gonna put it into the base color of the screw decal that we have here. And although I'm having this black rim, I'm already seeing the difference which the ambient occlusion makes here by muting and unmuting it with M. So the next thing we want to bake is a mask. So in order that we don't need to render the whole rectangle, but only the areas that should be visible, namely the rim and the screw itself. So in order to bake masks, I have to use a trick. I can't use the principled BSDF for this. So I have to get a source which I can bake. And the easiest way is to use an emission shader and simply setting it to 1 and white, which will be the perfect color for baking. So we're keeping it this way. It's simply illuminated now, and we're creating a new map. We call this screw alpha, or let's better call it screw mask because it's a mask and not an alpha. And we're going to keep the resolution, also the data itself, and set it to non-color because it's also non-color data. And now we're going to change our bake type from ambient occlusion, which we had here, to emit. And emit is going to bake our emission. So we are making sure we've selected the right objects again, which is the same order as before. If I would hit bake this way, it would bake completely nonsense, and it's warning me about this. And I'm selecting all 3 objects with the plane active, and now it's baking. And now I can watch this mask that I've created. It's simply a white circle, which will lead to problems later on, but I'll get back to that. And now we can simply test if our mask is correct by inserting another image texture. So I have to first set our blending mode in a viewport display to alpha blend in order to display transparency in Eevee. And now I can insert a mix shader, which I need. The second shader is our object itself. The first is the alpha, which will be transparent. So we're gonna add a transparent BSDF shader here. I'm gonna add this one and put it in the first shader input, which will be triggered by the value 0 or black. And now I'm gonna use my texture. I've duplicated this node. switching to the mask and putting the color into the factor of the mix shader. And now I can see it already made those black areas we had before transparent, which is exactly what I wanted to achieve. And now we can use this as a better decal. Another thing I want to bake is a mask simply for the rim. So it's completely sufficient to only select the ring and the plane afterwards. Create a new mask here, a screw rim mask, with the same measurements, of course, and setting it to non-color. And I'm gonna hit bake again, and this time it's only baking my only selected object, the rim, to my active object, the plane. And now see I have those ring baked, which will soon lead to problems because of the margin. I'm going to show you this. So I'm gonna split up my material now because I need two materials. The rim usually is the material of the surrounding mesh if you put decals in. I'm gonna simulate this by a different material. So I'm copying the principled shader here and putting another mix shader later on here, but first I'm gonna add my rim mask, and then I'm copying this mix shader. As we're taking the rim for value 1, we have to input the shader into shader 2. So I'm gonna connect this one down to the second shader input, which will be triggered by the value 1 of white. And here I'm choosing something metallic, which looks pretty good. And on the outside here, I want a completely different color, so maybe something red. I'm gonna check this one. The roughness down a little bit. It's mirroring pretty good, so we have this reflections here. But our normal information is still missing, which we baked from the curvature of the rim. We're gonna put it in the principled here, and it looks pretty good, although I have some kind of border here between the screw and the surrounding area, which seems not quite correct, which is caused by the margin we had active for baking the rim texture or the rim mask. And we had a margin of 16 pixels, which Blender is then later on adding in the post-processing of the bake. And now we're baking it with a margin of 0 pixels, which should result in a correct mask. So we're waiting for it to finish. So it's finished now, and we have a bit narrow circle, which we have for the mask. I'm going to refresh it by simply unplugging and replugging the color output into the factor input. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and it looks way better than before. Of course, we have a border here because we have a mask that we used here, but now the mask seems to be correct as the whole screw is displayed correctly. And therefore we have baked all our necessary maps, and now we have the option of baking another type or baking additional maps, like a second normal map, or even combine it with the first normal map. We could also create color maps for all the stuff. For some we would need definitely an emission shader, as Blender is not capable of baking everything we want. But I'm gonna simulate something here. Let's assume we have a simple material here for our screw, and which is the metallic and has a bit darker bluish color. And let's say we have some kind of distortion, for example on the roughness, for our screw, which comes maybe from an image texture. In this case I'll use a procedural noise texture because I don't have a fitting image texture for this. So I'm checking it with the node wrangler, giving it a bigger scale, and gonna input this into the roughness. And the roughness seems a little bit high, so I'm gonna convert it down with a math node by multiplying it. So you could use other functions like power or stuff like that, but I like to use multiply, and I'm gonna multiply it with something even lower, 0.3 maybe, and that looks pretty good. So we're gonna take this result, and if you want to bake this, this would be no problem. So you simply have to use the workflow we used before And for roughness, we even have a single channel to bake. But if, for example, you want to bake the metallicness because you have a mixed object, you would have to put the input of the metallic into an emission shader and bake it as emission, as Blender does not provide a way to bake metalness or metallic factor of our mesh. And I guess it looks pretty good, so we're really ready to go. And now it's time, so we have to save all of our data here, especially our maps. We must not forget to save our images because right at the moment they're just temporarily available in our blend file, but we have to save them as separate images by simply save them as a PNG, which is sufficient for the normal map, and also save the other maps too. I'm doing that right now, and we're creating a new scene, adding a plane, and on this plane we're gonna create, or this plane is our decal, and now we're gonna create a material which has all the information that we baked in the first place. And I can simply drag and drop the images from my Explorer into Blender, which will then automatically create an image texture node that I can use straightforward. So I'm inputting the normal map here and creating a normal map node, which I put the data into. And the one thing I must not forget is to set it to non-color data. It's not doing this automatically because right now this is a simple image texture to Blender and it doesn't know it's a normal map. So we have to set non-color data, which visibly improved the normals. And it looks pretty good. We have our curvature informations here. We can scale it down a little bit as screws aren't big normally. And now I have to input my other maps. So I'm gonna start with the Ambient Occlusion. And I think I'll input the texture first. And I set it to non-color. And I could use the mix RGB, but I'll do it later. I'm gonna input it first here. So we're seeing a color which is correctly seeing the ambient occlusion, but maybe I want a different color for this, so not to be white, but another color. So I'm using a mix RGB node, putting it in the second input and setting the mode to multiply and creating the factor up to 1. And now I can select a different color, maybe darker, maybe brighter. I'm going for a bluish color, which should be sufficient. And now the AO information is multiplied to this color and is given into the base color of the principal shader, which is the normal way of inserting ambient occlusion. So now it's time for inserting the masks, but I'll change the mode to alpha blend. And now we can add our mask again in order to get our transparency. So I'm changing back to the object material. I'm gonna add a mix shader here and putting it into the second input. Now I'm dragging in here my mask file. It's a PNG, and gonna move it slightly over here, putting it into the factor, and now I'm gonna add a transparent BSDF. I'm gonna mix it with the principled, and it looks pretty nice as we've expected, and it looks pretty good even from a far distance. Maybe I'm gonna change the ambient occlusion intensity, so therefore if I want to do this I can just move this over and insert a math converter as it's on the black and white data, so from 0 to 1. And I'm gonna set it to multiply, and now I can darken or lighten it, but it's affecting the whole AO. Maybe we could use the power function, but I think I'll leave it the original way. But just to let you know, you can do this. And next thing I'm gonna do is I'm duplicating the principled BSDF in order to create the material for the rim. I'm gonna slightly move it over. The transparent doesn't belong here. And now I need to add another mix shader in order to mix it with a rim material, which we can later on replace. And I need my rim mask. So I'm putting it in here and oops, wrong input. So the shaders now have mixed up. So I need to change this. But first I'm gonna plug in the normal into the normal input of the BSDF in order to get the curvature. I guess the inputs are right. And now we're seeing a slight ring above there, which is due to the margin we had set at baking. And the last thing we need to do now is to save our file to append it or link it later in different projects. So we're going to save it as a screw decal because it's a decal already now. And now I'm going to open up another scene in order to show you how you can use this decal on objects. And therefore, I'm going to create a complex scene. I'm going to speed this workflow up here. Just creating some simple objects here. And I'm going to use an HDRI for lighting. You can get those at hdrihaven.com. Just visit it. They are free, but also feel free to support the creator of the HDRIs. So now we've prepared a sample scene and can now append our decal from our file we've created. It's enough to import simply the plane because all materials and images for the textures will be imported respectively for that. And I've imported it now, it's pretty small. And the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm setting up the snapping mode, so align to center on the face and also align the rotation, because if I move it normally with G, it's not snapping, but when holding the Ctrl key pressed, snapping is activated and the decal also aligns. Now we have some sort of set fighting here, and I can move the plane manually in order to avoid it, or I can simply displace it. The set fighting is always occurring if two planes are identically in each other. And I will use the displace modifier because it's somehow more convenient for me. And now I see the offset is pretty small. I can even put it further to the surface, so it's even a smaller gap between the decal and the object itself. The main purpose of this is to simply avoid shadows that are casted from the decal to the object itself. So therefore we need to make sure that the gap isn't that big. We see that we have this blue ring on the outside of here. That's how I mentioned before. Due to the margin we have set at baking, because we had a margin of 16 pixels when baking the original mask. And now I think we can use it. And we can now exchange our material if we want, but we can also resize it. We can rotate it, move it around. When holding the Ctrl key, it would automatically align. And that's one big advantage of using the displace modifier, because it will also displace when you move it around. If you would have moved it with the transform operation, you would have to repeat this step again after moving the decal. So now I've duplicated it and moved it to our cylindrical object, and I'm already seeing that it's a flat plane that is aligned on some sort of tangent point, but is not wrapping to the surface. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm replacing the material for the rim. So I'm deleting the original BSDF here and pasting in the BSDF from our surrounding materials, so from the cylindrical object. I'm going to put it into the input here and connect the normal. Whoops. The input switched due to the fact that I've dragged it to the wrong input, so I've got to change this again. And now I have to simply drag my normal output into the normal input of the BSDF in order to get the curvature on the rim. And it looks pretty good. We can ignore the ring itself now, this blue ring on the outside, but we need to align it to the object, because in this way it's not looking pretty good. And therefore we're going to use a bunch of modifiers. So the first one we're going to take is the shrink wrap modifier, which will wrap it around the object. So we're selecting our cylinder and now it's gone. And this is due to the fact that we need to subdivide our geometry because the shrink wrap is actually using the geometry of our plane and it wasn't subdivided enough in order to shrink wrap it. I'm gonna change the mid-level of the displace modifier. Maybe it's a bit far from the surface, but it's just some kind of playing around with the values until you wrap it around. And now I can see some small problems with shading. So we have some edges here due to the subdivisions we made. It's pretty hard to see, but in this case it's slightly visible. On other occasions this is even more visible and can't be ignored or overseen. So first thing we're going to do is we'll let it render in cycles to get a better view of this. And one thing we can do now is to use the same normals that our underlying surface is providing, namely the cylindrical object, and therefore we're going to use the data transfer modifier. And now we can simply select our cylindrical object as a source and choose the face mapping to projected face interpolated and the custom normals. And now we're already getting a warning that we need to enable auto smooth. So I'm just activating this, and now we can see that the normals from our underlying surface are transferred to our object. I can simply put the roughness down a little bit to see the reflections, and we're seeing that we're having also the reflections from a cylindrical object, and we have no edges existing anymore here. It could very well be that there remain some slight problems which are most of the time not that visible, but as we are using this object on a very small scale and not for very detailed renderings, no one should be able to see these mistakes. And now I can even duplicate this, but due to the fact that we've moved it with the snapping tool and it's not aligned properly, it will be pretty hard using the area modifier. I'm gonna show you anyway how you do it. So moving the area modifier up the stack, so it's just below the subdivision surface modifier and before the shrink wrap modifier. And now I can use a constant offset, maybe about, let's say 20 centimeters, maybe a bit small, so I'm gonna increase it even more, 80 centimeters. It looks good, but I already see it's turning up somehow a little bit. So if I increase the value now, it's snapped to completely different spots by the shrink wrap modifier. And this could be due to the wrong rotation and due to wrong calculations here. So I cannot try to reset the rotation, but I guess it's not helping that much. So if this happens to you when you use the area modifier, you can always try resetting the object by the rotation, or you completely avoid using the area modifier and instead reinstantiating it. But it's some kind of playing around with the rotation in order to get the area modifier working. I'm now letting it the way it is because we've already shown how this works. Next thing we're gonna do is projecting text as a decal on our objects, which is another common use case. In this case, we don't want to incorporate it in the original UV, but simply overlaying it the way we did with the other decals. So first I'm gonna create a plane here, and I'm inserting some text. So you can do this in Krita too, or in GIMP, but I tend to work with Photoshop. So I'm gonna input here hello shader. You're not seeing it because it's white, so I'm showing you. You see hello shader. The one thing I'm gonna do is I'm leaving it white because I don't want a black value when using it in Blender, and therefore I'm leaving it white. And now I'll insert a new layer, a fill layer. You don't need to select the color here. It's only the background color in the layer stack. And we get to choose the color of the layer itself later on here. So now I'm moving it below the text in order to see it. And now we can simply adjust the text, moving it to about the center. I'm gonna resize it even a little bit. I guess that's big enough. Maybe rotating it somehow. And it looks pretty good. But even the fonts, I want to use a font, for example, something you see on military crates in games, maybe something like Stencil. Stencil is widely used texture, even for, especially for military stuff in games. And I guess this looks pretty good. So now I want to save my object. I can save it as a PSD because Blender can handle PSD files. Gonna save it here. And now I want to deactivate the black layer because I don't need it in Blender. And here I can import it, but I'll switch to Eevee first in order to get faster feedback from the UI. So just waiting a little bit, looks pretty good. So now I'm simply dragging in a plane. I can align it by holding the Ctrl key when dragging. I can also reset the rotation here in order to make it pretty aligned. And now I can snap it again, move it that way. It looks pretty good. As it's a square and we have a square texture, we don't need to do any UV mapping. And I just can drag and drop my PSD file in here. Sometimes you get an error when you do this. Give it a second try because Blender often throws errors which are somehow randomly. I haven't figured it out why it does it this way, but never mind. It worked on the second attempt, and now I'm gonna insert another transparent PSDF, so I have to change my blend mode. And I'm gonna add a mix shader first. And as our text is on the white area, we need to use the second shader input. And now I'm using the transparent PSDF for the first shader input. And now, in order to define the transparent, I want to use the alpha output of the texture. But I've already seen with the node wrangler that it's all white. So we need to go back to our Photoshop. And in Photoshop, as we have artboard used here, we need to select the artboard. And here you have options for resizing the canvas. And you can do adjustments. But down here you have the background color. And if you scroll down, you'll also get the drop down. Here you can select transparent, and now we're seeing the usual transparent texture in the background. I'm gonna save it, and to refresh this, I'm gonna load the PSD in here, and in the menu, image, reload. So now we're seeing that we're getting the alpha, and it's flipped around. By pressing Ctrl T, I can bring up the mapping menu. This is the Node Wrangler add-on. And I'm gonna rotate it on the Z axis by 180 degrees. So now it's with the correct rotation. And now we wanna align it the same way we did with the decals before. And with the copy attributes add-on, I can simply select both and copy with Ctrl C and all selected modifiers because they are handled the same way. But I see the shrink wrap modifier makes some problems here, so I got to slightly rescale this. And also we have the problem, we have a much bigger plane now, and somehow I need to bring it out of there. So I can simply put up the subdivisions on one level, and looks pretty good now. So another thing I need to do is enable the auto smoothing. I'm getting the warning here, and it looks almost good here, but we need also to change the offset. I have another warning here. I can simply resize it because sometimes those are really just warnings, like in this case that with this resolution it will be a bit slower, which I don't mind in this case. And now I can go up here and change the mid level, and now the texture is fully visible. And I can adjust this text now. So I simply can change, for example, to a yellowish, a little bit alerted color, which looks better on olive green. And now I can also use some noise. So I can use a noise texture to create some noise for our font. We could also do this in Photoshop, but I'm gonna do it in here. Just another color ramp in order to put the black a little bit up and the whites also a little bit brighter. Looks pretty good. So we're gonna use it, and now we're using a math converter again in order to mix it up with our font. So I'm just inputting it here and setting the mode to multiply. And now we can watch the final result. So we have some sort of procedural noise, which is not looking that good as if we would have made it here in Photoshop with some sort of filters or other layers and the blend modes of the layers. But that's up to you how you want to do it. And now I would have needed to convert it to a smart object if I want to insert some noise, for example. So I'm seeing it here. Pretty noisy, but also colorful, and I don't want it this way, so we're keeping it in Blender for now. And that's pretty much it. So we have used a square. You could also use a rectangle, which fits the text perfectly, but it also works on this way. I hope you had fun with this tutorial and you learned some really important stuff. The next time we're gonna have a look at the Paralytic Occlusion, which can be used for 2D images and normal maps which don't have the height information stored in them, to simply create the illusion of a three-dimensional effect without needing to use displacement and respective subdivision surface and stuff like that. A little warning to this will be a pretty complex topic, but I'll provide you the node groups that we create within the tutorial so that you can use them later on, even if you don't understand exactly how paralytic occlusion works. So see you next time.